Muslim woman insulted for wearing hijab, then Oprah's move shocks everyone. How will this story escalate? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The cafe buzzed with its usual mid-morning energy, baristas calling out orders, the hum of conversation filling the air, and the soft clinking of coffee cups against saucers. Amina stepped inside, adjusting her hijab as she glanced around for an empty table. She had always loved this place, a cozy little spot tucked into the corner of the city, where she could sit, sip her chai and catch up on emails before heading to work. But today something felt off. As she approached the counter, she could feel eyes on her. It wasn't unusual. She was used to the stares, the double takes, the lingering glances. Some were simply curious, others filled with something colder, something unspoken. She took a steadying breath and stepped forward to place her order. "One chai latte, please." The barista, a young man with slicked back hair and an impatient expression, barely looked up from the register. "Name?" "Amina," she said, offering a polite smile. His lips twitched, and for a brief second, something flickered across his face. Disdain? Annoyance? Whatever it was, it disappeared just as quickly. "Sure," he muttered, punching in her order. She stepped aside to wait, pulling out her phone to check messages. But before she could focus, a voice from behind the counter caught her attention. Another one of them? The words were quiet but not quiet enough. Amina's stomach dropped. She looked up. The barista was speaking to his coworker, a smirk playing at his lips as he nodded subtly in her direction. The coworker chuckled under his breath. Surprised she's not ordering for her husband? A slow heat spread across Amina's chest. She should have ignored it. She should have just taken her drink and left. That's what she always did. But today she couldn't. She turned to face them, her fingers tightening around her phone. "Excuse me?" The barista's smirk faltered. He hadn't expected her to hear. "Nothing," he said, shaking his head. "Just talking to my coworker." Amina's heart pounded. She wasn't surprised, but that didn't make it sting any less. "You weren't just talking," she said, her voice even. "You were talking about me?" The coworker scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Relax, lady. It's a joke." "A joke? Of course. That was always the excuse." Before Amina could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "I didn't hear anything funny." The cafe went silent. Amina turned, and her breath caught in her throat. Standing behind her, arms crossed, was a woman everyone in the room recognized. Oprah Winfrey. The barista's face went pale. The coworker stiffened. The entire cafe seemed to be holding its breath. Amina's pulse thundered. Oprah took a step forward, her expression calm but sharp. "I'd love for you to explain," she continued, her gaze locked onto the barista. "What exactly was the joke?" The room was so quiet you could hear the steam hissing from the espresso machine. The barista stammered, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. Oprah tilted her head, waiting. "Well?" Amina could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone in the cafe. The stares that had once been on her were now on them. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't the one who had to defend herself. Someone else was standing beside her. And the entire world was watching. The silence in the cafe stretched, thick and suffocating. The barista shifted uncomfortably, his smirk long gone, replaced by something resembling panic. His coworker, who had been so quick to laugh just moments ago, looked like he wanted to disappear. Amina stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent years brushing off moments like this, forcing herself to move on, to not make a scene. But now, for the first time, someone else was calling it out. And not just anyone. Oprah Winfrey. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone in the room. People who had been sipping their coffees, typing on their laptops, scrolling through their phones, all eyes were now on the baristas. Oprah took a slow step forward, her expression calm but unwavering. "Well," she repeated, voice steady, controlled. "I'm waiting." The barista swallowed hard. I didn't mean anything by it," he stammered. "It was just, a comment." "A comment?" Oprah raised an eyebrow. The coworker jumped in, desperate to smooth things over. "Yeah, we were just talking. It wasn't personal." A quiet scoff came from someone in the cafe. Amina wasn't sure who, but the energy had shifted. People weren't just watching anymore. They were judging. Oprah inhaled, exhaled, then placed her hands on the counter. "Let me ask you something." The barista's face was now beet red. He nodded stiffly, barely meeting her gaze. "If she weren't wearing a hijab," Oprah said, nodding toward Amina, "would you have said the same thing?" The question landed like a thunderclap. The barista blinked. I don't know. You do know. Oprah's voice was gentle but firm. And so does everyone in this room. A murmur rippled through the cafe. A few people nodded. One woman whispered something to her friend, shaking her head. Amina felt it. This wasn't just a moment anymore. This was accountability. The barista shifted from foot to foot, looking to his coworker for help, but there was no saving this. Oprah straightened, her presence alone commanding the space. Here's the thing, she said. People remember moments like this. They remember how they felt. They remember who stood by and did nothing and who spoke up. She glanced at Amina, her expression softening just slightly. And more than anything, they remember who made them feel like they belonged. Amina's throat tightened. She had spent so much of her life trying to belong. And now, for the first time, someone had reminded her that she already did. The barista swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry? Oprah didn't move, didn't react. Instead, she looked at Amina. It's not me you should be saying that to. Amina blinked, suddenly realizing she had the power in this moment. For once, she wasn't the one scrambling for words. She turned to the barista, studying him. He was embarrassed, clearly uncomfortable, but was it because he felt guilty or because he had been caught? Did it even matter? She inhaled slowly, then exhaled, keeping her voice steady. I hope you actually mean that. The barista nodded quickly. I do. Amina let the words settle, then gave a small nod. Then do better. The barista swallowed and looked down, clearly shaken. Oprah stepped back, adjusting her sweater as if that was that. But the cafe wasn't the same anymore. The power had shifted. And for the first time, Amina wasn't walking away feeling smaller. She was walking away standing taller. Amina took a deep breath, steadying herself as the weight of the moment settled. She could still feel the tension lingering in the cafe, the unspoken energy buzzing between the customers, the baristas, and Oprah herself. But something had changed. For once, she wasn't the one expected to shrink. She wasn't the one smoothing things over, laughing it off, making it easier for everyone else. The air in the cafe had shifted, and this time, it wasn't her burden to carry. Oprah adjusted her sleeve, still watching the barista with the same quiet intensity. The young man nodded stiffly, his jaw tight, as if he still hadn't fully processed what had just happened. His coworker, who had laughed at the cruel joke only minutes before, had gone pale. Amina looked around, noticing the way people were still watching. Some with approval, some with discomfort, but no one had ignored what had happened. That was the biggest difference. Because usually, these moments went unnoticed. Usually no one spoke up. Usually she had to swallow the words that burned in her throat and pretend it didn't matter. But today someone had said something. And that made all the difference. Oprah finally broke the silence, turning back to Amina with a small, knowing smile. Shall we sit? Amina blinked, caught off guard. What? Oprah gestured toward the small round tables scattered near the window. I was planning to have my coffee here anyway. I'd love the company. The entire cafe seemed to hold its breath. The Oprah Winfrey was inviting her to sit? Amina hesitated, glancing around, feeling the heat of dozens of curious eyes on her. But then she met Oprah's gaze, warm and patient, and something inside her settled. She nodded. Yeah, I'd like that. The barista, still flustered, quickly slid her chai latte across the counter, his hands trembling slightly. On the house, he muttered. Oprah arched an eyebrow. I bet it is. A few people in the cafe chuckled, the tension cracking just a little. Amina took her drink, her fingers curling around the warmth of the cup. Without another glance at the counter, she turned and followed Oprah to a quiet table near the window. As they sat down, Amina let out a slow breath, finally allowing herself to absorb what had just happened. For so long, she had taught herself to move past moments like this. But today, she had been reminded that she didn't have to. She deserved to exist in this world without having to apologize for it. And today, the world had been forced to notice. Amina settled into her seat across from Oprah, still feeling the weight of the moment pressing against her chest. The cafe had begun to move again, customers returning to their conversations, baristas pretending to focus on their work. But the energy in the room was different now. People weren't just ignoring what had happened. They had seen it. They had felt it. And Amina had felt something shift inside her too. She curled her hands around her chai latte, the warmth grounding her. Across the table, Oprah took a slow sip of her coffee, watching her with the kind of patience that only someone who truly understood could offer. You okay? Oprah finally asked, her voice low enough that no one else could hear. Amina let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. I think so. I don't know. That was... She trailed off, searching for the right word. Oprah smiled knowingly. Unexpected? Amina nodded. Yeah. I mean, I'm used to this kind of thing happening. But I'm not used to what you did. Oprah set her cup down. And why do you think that is? Amina exhaled, fingers tightening around her drink. Because most people just stay quiet. They don't want to get involved. And I get it. It's easier that way. Oprah tilted her head slightly. For who? The question landed harder than Amina expected. She blinked, looking down at her drink. She had spent so much of her life telling herself that it was easier for everyone if she just let things go. That standing up for herself was too much trouble, that it wouldn't change anything. But whose comfort had she been protecting? Certainly not her own. Oprah leaned forward slightly, her voice softer now. You've been carrying this for a long time, haven't you? Amina swallowed, her throat tight. She had. She had carried it in every glance that lingered too long. In every comment disguised as a joke. In every time she had walked into a room and felt the shift. The moment when people decided what she was before she even opened her mouth. She had carried it in her silence. Because silence had always felt safer. Until today. She exhaled shakily, looking back up. Yeah, she admitted. I have. Oprah nodded as if she already knew. And what are you going to do with that? Amina blinked. What do you mean? Oprah smiled, but there was something serious in her gaze. You stood your ground today. And you weren't alone. You saw what happens when people say something. Amina nodded slowly. You can't control how people treat you, Oprah continued, but you can control what you accept. You can control what you let pass without a word. Amina took a deep breath, letting the words sink in. She had always thought that standing up for herself meant choosing a fight. But maybe it wasn't about fighting at all. Maybe it was just about choosing herself. And today, for the first time, she had. She met Oprah's gaze, something steadier settling inside her. I think I'm ready to stop staying quiet. Oprah smiled. Good. And for the first time, Amina truly believed that her voice mattered. Amina sat with Oprah in the quiet corner of the cafe, the weight of the moment settling into something deeper. It wasn't just about what had happened at the counter, it was about all the moments that had come before it. The ones she had let pass. The ones she had convinced herself weren't worth the fight. But today had been different. Because today she hadn't been alone. She traced the rim of her cup with her finger, exhaling. I've always told myself that silence was easier, she admitted. That if I ignored it, if I just kept my head down, I could move on without it affecting me. Oprah nodded, listening. And has that worked? Amina let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. Not really. I just ended up carrying it instead. Oprah's gaze softened. Exactly. Amina looked around the cafe, noticing how different the space felt now. The tension that had filled the air earlier had shifted. People weren't just pretending nothing had happened. They had seen the moment unfold, had felt the power of it. And that meant something. For once, she wasn't the only one walking away with the weight of it. Oprah took a sip of her coffee, setting the cup down before leaning in slightly. You know, I wasn't always who I am today. Amina raised an eyebrow, surprised. What do you mean? Oprah smiled, but there was something reflective in her expression. There was a time when I didn't know how to stand up for myself either. When I thought keeping the peace was more important than protecting my own dignity. Amina blinked. I can't imagine that. Oprah chuckled. Most people can't. But I had to learn just like you. Amina frowned, tilting her head. What changed? Oprah held her gaze, her voice steady. I realized that silence doesn't protect you. It just makes room for people to keep doing the same thing. And once I understood that, I couldn't unsee it. Amina sat with that for a moment. She had spent so much time trying to avoid conflict, trying not to make herself a target. But had her silence ever actually made her safer? Had it ever stopped people from making their comments, from staring, from reducing her to a stereotype before they even knew her name? No. All silence had done was make it easier for them. She exhaled, something shifting inside her. I think I get it now, she murmured. Oprah smiled. Good. Amina felt something settle in her chest, a quiet kind of certainty. She wasn't naive. She knew moments like this wouldn't stop happening. But maybe, just maybe, she was done accepting them. For the first time, she wasn't just enduring. She was choosing herself. And that changed everything. Amina sat back in her chair, letting the weight of Oprah's words settle. The cafe felt quieter now, but not in an awkward way. It was the kind of silence that comes after a truth has been spoken, the kind that changes something. She wrapped her hands around her cup, feeling the warmth seep into her palms. I've spent so much time just trying to blend in, she admitted. Trying to make myself small so I wouldn't be a target? Oprah nodded knowingly. Because you thought that would keep you safe? Amina exhaled, staring down at her latte. Yeah. Oprah leaned forward slightly. And has it? Amina hesitated. She had always told herself that staying quiet, avoiding attention, was the best way to move through the world without conflict. But had it really stopped people from treating her differently? No. No matter how quiet she was, no matter how much she tried to disappear, people like that barista still found a reason to single her out. She looked back up at Oprah. No, she admitted. It hasn't. Oprah smiled gently. That's because the problem was never you. Amina swallowed hard, the truth of that hitting her like a wave. She had spent so many years wondering what she could do differently, how she could avoid these situations, how she could prevent people from treating her like she didn't belong. But she was never the problem. She never had been. And once she let go of the idea that it was her responsibility to keep other people comfortable, everything suddenly felt different. Lighter. She took a deep breath, feeling something settle inside her that she hadn't realized had been shaken loose. Oprah watched her, studying her face. You don't owe the world your silence, Amina. Amina nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around her cup. I think I'm finally starting to believe that. The older woman smiled. Good. For the first time in a long time, Amina didn't feel like she was carrying the moment alone. She didn't feel like she had to brush it off or pretend it didn't matter. Because today had been proof that it did matter. Her voice mattered. She mattered. And she wasn't going to forget that again. Amina sat in the warmth of the cafe, feeling the weight of everything she had carried for so long begin to shift. It wasn't that the world had suddenly changed, it hadn't. There would still be people like that barista, still be moments where she had to decide whether to speak or stay silent. But she had changed. For the first time, she wasn't wondering what she had done wrong. She wasn't replaying the moment in her head, searching for ways she could have avoided it. She wasn't blaming herself. That realization settled deep in her chest, steady and grounding. Oprah took another sip of her coffee, watching her with a quiet kind of patience. You seem different now, she observed. Amina let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. I think I am. Why? Amina thought about it for a moment, then met Oprah's gaze. Because I finally get it. It's not about avoiding conflict. It's about knowing I deserve to be here. Oprah smiled, nodding. That's right. Amina exhaled, looking around the cafe. People had moved on, conversations had resumed, but she could still feel the shift in the air. The weight of what had happened still lingered, not just for her but for everyone who had watched. That barista would remember today. The customers would too. And maybe, just maybe, the next time something like this happened, to her or someone else, they wouldn't stay silent. Amina turned back to Oprah, tilting her head. Why did you step in? Oprah's smile was knowing. Because someone once did it for me. Amina blinked, surprised. Oprah set her cup down, leaning in slightly. People assume I've always been the person I am today. That I've always been able to command a room, to speak my truth without fear. But that's not how it started. Amina listened, leaning in as well. There was a time when I thought the best way to survive was to stay small. To not draw attention, to not challenge the way things were. Oprah's voice was steady, but there was something deeper there, something raw. But then someone spoke up for me. And it changed everything. Amina swallowed hard, feeling the impact of those words. And once you know what that feels like, Oprah continued, you can't ignore it when it happens to someone else. Amina nodded slowly, the truth of it settling in her bones. She wasn't alone. She had never been. There had always been people before her. People who had stood up, spoken out, refused to shrink. And now it was her turn. She took a deep breath, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. I think I'm done staying small. Oprah smiled, lifting her cup in a mock toast. I think you are too. Amina clinked her cup against Oprah's, a small but powerful gesture. And as she took a sip, she knew she would never let herself be invisible again. Amina sat back in her chair, letting the warmth of her chai and Oprah's words settle inside her. The cafe around them had returned to normal, people chatting, sipping their drinks, the baristas moving through their routine. But for Amina, nothing felt normal anymore. She had walked in expecting another ordinary morning, another routine stop for a drink. Instead, she had faced the same prejudice she had encountered so many times before. But today she hadn't just swallowed it and moved on. Today someone had stood beside her. And that had made all the difference. She turned her cup slowly in her hands, looking up at Oprah again. So, what happened after that moment for you? When someone stood up for you? Oprah exhaled, tilting her head in thought. I changed. Little by little, I started seeing myself differently. I stopped waiting for permission to take up space. And most importantly, I started doing the same thing for others. Amina nodded, feeling the truth of that settle deep. Oprah leaned in slightly. And now you have a choice. Amina blinked. A choice? To keep living the way you always have, staying quiet, avoiding conflict, letting things slide. Oprah paused, her voice steady. Or to step into the version of yourself that knows you belong, that doesn't second-guess whether or not you should speak up. Amina felt her chest tighten. She had spent so many years convincing herself that letting things go was easier. That it was better not to make a scene, not to challenge people, not to give them a reason to see her as a problem. But today had proven that no matter what she did, some people would still try to make her feel like she didn't belong. And no amount of silence would change that. Amina took a deep breath, finally saying the words out loud. I think I'm tired of letting things slide. Oprah smiled, nodding. Then you're already on the right path. Amina let that sink in, staring out the window for a moment. The rain had stopped, and the streets glistened under the soft morning sun. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel weighed down. She felt free. She turned back to Oprah, smiling softly. Thank you. Oprah shook her head. Don't thank me. Just pay it forward. Amina exhaled, nodding. She would. Because if today had taught her anything, it was that one moment of courage could change everything. And the next time she saw someone in her position, she would be the one to stand up. Amina sat quietly, letting Oprah's words settle in a way that felt permanent, unshakable. Pay it forward. She had spent so much of her life absorbing the weight of moments like today, letting them pile up inside her, convincing herself that staying silent was the easiest way to survive. But survival wasn't enough anymore. She wanted more. She wanted to exist freely without feeling like she had to justify her presence. She wanted to walk into places like this cafe and not have to brace herself for the worst. And maybe that wasn't something she could change overnight. Maybe the world wouldn't shift just because she had made the choice to stop shrinking. But she could start with herself. She could start with today. Amina glanced around the cafe, noting how different the space felt now. The people who had witnessed everything had gone back to their drinks, but she could still feel the shift in the air. The barista Tom, the same one who had mocked her just minutes ago, was still at the counter. But he wasn't smirking anymore. His movements were stiff, mechanical. It was clear that what had happened had shaken him, whether he admitted it or not. She wasn't naive enough to believe he would suddenly change overnight. But at the very least he would think twice next time. And that was enough for now. She turned back to Oprah, who was watching her carefully, as if studying her face for something unspoken. Feels different, doesn't it? Oprah finally asked. Amina nodded. Yeah, it does. Why do you think that is? Amina exhaled, running a finger along the rim of her cup. Because for once, I didn't just walk away pretending it didn't matter. Oprah smiled. Exactly. Amina let that settle inside her. She had spent so many years training herself to move on as quickly as possible. To let people say whatever they wanted and just push forward, untouched. But today had proven what she had always known deep down. Words had power. Theirs. And hers. She took a slow sip of her chai, feeling steadier than she had in a long time. Oprah set her cup down and folded her hands in front of her. So, what are you going to do with this moment? Amina blinked, caught off guard. What do you mean? Oprah tilted her head slightly. You could let it be just another thing that happened. Or you could let it be the beginning of something bigger. Amina thought about that. She had never seen herself as the kind of person who made waves. She had always been the quiet one, the observer, the person who let things go. But maybe she didn't have to be. Maybe today was the start of something different. She met Oprah's gaze, a small but certain smile forming on her lips. I think I'm ready to stop letting things go. Oprah's expression softened with something like approval. Then you're already halfway there. Amina nodded, taking in the weight of that statement. Because today had shown her something she couldn't ignore. Her voice mattered. And from this moment on, she was going to use it. Amina sat back in her chair, her fingers lightly tapping against the side of her cup as Oprah's words settled deep within her. Let this be the beginning of something bigger. She had never considered herself someone who could spark change. She had spent years believing that silence was easier, that staying quiet kept her safe. But now, sitting across from one of the most influential women in the world, she realized something critical. Silence hadn't protected her. It had only made room for others to keep doing the same thing. She exhaled, a slow, steady breath, feeling something click into place inside her. Oprah watched her, nodding as if she could see the shift happening in real time. You're realizing something, aren't you? Amina hesitated, then nodded. Yeah. I think I've spent my whole life waiting for things to get better on their own. Oprah tilted her head slightly. And? Amina let out a quiet chuckle, shaking her head. They never did. Because they don't, Oprah said gently. Change isn't something that just happens. It's something people make happen. Amina exhaled. That was the part she had always struggled with. The idea that she had to be the one to fight, to push back. She had spent so long trying to avoid being seen as a problem, as someone who was too sensitive or looking for an issue. But why was it always on her to make things easier for everyone else? Why wasn't it on them? Oprah leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. I have a feeling that today won't be the last time you find yourself in a moment like this. Amina swallowed, nodding. I know. And next time? Amina thought about it. About all the times she had let people's words slide. All the times she had smiled through discomfort just to keep the peace. Then she thought about today. About how different it had felt to stand her ground. She looked back at Oprah, steady and sure. Next time, I won't wait for someone else to speak up first. A slow, approving smile spread across Oprah's face. Good. Amina felt something in her chest loosen, a kind of freedom she had never let herself feel before. She had spent years learning how to move quietly, how to blend in, shrink, take up less space. But today had shown her that she was allowed to exist fully. She took a deep breath and straightened in her chair, feeling taller somehow. More solid. More herself. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. The cafe continued to hum around them, but Amina felt like she was existing in a space outside of it. The world hadn't changed, but she had. For the first time, she wasn't replaying the moment, wondering what she could have done differently. She wasn't carrying the weight of regret, thinking about all the times she had let something slide. Instead, she was here, present, unshaken. She had always thought speaking up would make her feel exposed, like a spotlight was being forced on her when all she wanted was to move through life unnoticed. But now she realized, it didn't make her feel exposed. It made her feel seen. She looked across the table at Oprah, who was still watching her with that quiet kind of patience, as if she had known all along that this was where Amina would end up. Oprah smiled slightly. You're different now. Amina let out a breath, nodding. I feel different. Good. Amina looked down at her cup, fingers brushing over the ceramic. I think I just spent so much time believing that moments like today weren't worth the energy. That people like him weren't worth the fight. Oprah tilted her head slightly. And now? Amina looked up. Now I realize, it's not about him. It's about me. Oprah's expression softened. Exactly. Amina swallowed. I let myself believe that letting things go made me stronger. But it didn't. It just made it easier for them to keep doing it. Oprah nodded. And easier for you to believe that you weren't worth standing up for. The words landed deep in Amina's chest. She had never put it into words like that before, but it was true. Every time she let it go, every time she told herself it wasn't a big deal, she had chipped away at her own worth. No more. She exhaled, rolling her shoulders back, sitting just a little taller. Oprah leaned forward slightly, resting her chin in her hand. So what now? Amina thought about that for a moment. She could walk out of here the same way she had entered, quiet, careful, bracing herself for the next time. Or she could leave with the certainty that she didn't have to be silent anymore. The choice was hers. And this time she knew exactly what to do. She met Oprah's gaze, her voice clear. I stopped waiting for permission to take up space. Oprah grinned, lifting her coffee in a small toast. Now that's a woman who knows her worth. Amina smiled back, lifting her cup as well. And as they clinked their mugs together, she knew this was the beginning of something new. Amina took a sip of her chai, the warmth settling inside her in a way that felt different now, more grounding, more intentional. She wasn't rushing to finish her drink, wasn't planning her exit before someone could say something else to make her uncomfortable. She was here, fully. And she wasn't in a hurry to leave. Oprah set her cup down, watching her with that quiet, knowing look. Feels good, doesn't it? Amina nodded slowly. Yeah, it does. She had never thought that a single moment could change so much. But it wasn't just about today, it was about everything that had led up to it. All the moments she had let go. All the times she had told herself it wasn't worth it. All the times she had made herself small. She had carried those moments for so long that she didn't even realize how heavy they had become. Until now. Until someone had reminded her that she didn't have to carry them alone. Oprah leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. You're not the same woman who walked in here this morning. Amina exhaled, shaking her head. I don't think I am. And she didn't want to be. Oprah smiled. So what happens next? Amina thought about that. For so long she had moved carefully, always adjusting, always making herself smaller to fit into spaces that weren't made for her. But what if she stopped doing that? What if she walked into the world the way she had walked into this cafe, with the full expectation that she belonged? She met Oprah's gaze steady now. Next time, I won't need someone else to speak first. Oprah nodded, a slow smile spreading across her face. That's what I like to hear. Amina let out a breath, looking around the cafe once more. It wasn't just a coffee shop anymore. It was a moment she would carry with her forever. Because today, for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was choosing herself. She picked up her cup, taking another sip, letting the moment settle into her bones. And as she placed it back down, she knew she would never let herself shrink again. Amina sat there, letting the moment stretch out, letting it belong to her. She wasn't rushing to finish her drink. She wasn't thinking about whether she had overstayed her welcome. She wasn't preoccupied with how others might perceive her presence. For the first time in a long time, she simply existed. And it felt powerful. Across from her, Oprah's gaze held something steady. Approval maybe, but more than that, recognition. She knew. She understood what it meant to carry the weight of the world's assumptions, to constantly navigate spaces where people questioned whether you belonged. And she knew what it meant to finally decide that you did. Amina exhaled slowly, setting her cup down. I always thought that if I just kept my head down, if I didn't give anyone a reason to single me out, I'd be okay. Oprah tilted her head slightly. And has that ever stopped them? Amina let out a soft, breathy laugh. No, it hasn't. Oprah nodded. Because the problem was never you. The words sank in, solidifying what Amina had started to realize in real time. It was never about what she wore, how she spoke, how much space she took up. It was them. Their prejudices. Their discomfort. Their refusal to see her as anything more than the version they had already created in their minds. And that was their burden to carry. Not hers. Amina lifted her chin slightly, feeling something settle inside her, something she didn't ever want to let go of again. She wasn't just accepting that she belonged. She was claiming it. Oprah gave her a small smile, as if she could hear the thoughts forming in her head. You're done explaining yourself, aren't you? Amina met her gaze, steady, sure. Yeah, I think I am. And God, did it feel good. For years, she had carried the weight of other people's perceptions, their ignorance, their discomfort. Today she was putting it down. She reached for her cup, took another slow sip, savoring the taste, the warmth, the certainty coursing through her veins. She had walked into this cafe the same way she had walked into countless others before, quiet, cautious, careful. But she would walk out different, because today had been a turning point, and from this moment forward, she would never let herself shrink again. Amina took a deep breath, letting the moment settle deep within her. This wasn't just about a conversation or even about what had happened at the counter. This was about every moment before today. Every time she had walked away. Every time she had let it slide. Every time she had told herself it wasn't worth it. But today had proven something she could never unlearn. She was worth it. Her presence, her voice, her right to exist without justification. It all mattered. She met Oprah's gaze one last time, the weight of everything they had spoken about reflected between them. You're ready? Oprah said simply. Amina didn't hesitate. Yeah, I am. And she meant it. She wasn't waiting for the world to decide if she belonged anymore. She had decided that for herself. Oprah smiled knowingly, giving her a slow nod of approval before finishing the last sip of her coffee. Amina followed, taking the final sip of her chai, savoring the warmth, not just of the drink but of who she had become in this moment. As she set the cup down, she realized something. She had walked into this cafe expecting nothing, and she was walking out with everything. Not because the world had suddenly changed, but because she had. And from this moment on, she would never, not for anyone, not for anything, shrink again. With one last glance around the cafe, she picked up her bag, stood a little taller, and walked toward the door. Not as someone hoping to be accepted, but as someone who already knew her worth. And this time, the world would just have to catch up.